The colonel's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the concrete floor of the operations tent. His eyes were fixed on the small embroidered patch sewn onto the flight suit of the woman standing before him. It wasn't the Apache helicopter wings that made him freeze. It wasn't even the rows of combat ribbons earned through blood and determination. It was something smaller, something that told a story of sacrifice that went beyond military service. Captain Sarah Chen had been fighting 2 wars her entire career, one against enemy forces in the desert, another against the voices that whispered she didn't belong in the cockpit of the most lethal attack helicopter in the world. She had proven herself in combat zones across 3 continents, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of every pilot who flew beside her. But none of that mattered when she walked into rooms filled with men who saw her as an outsider. Until the day she wore that patch. The patch was simple. A small piece of fabric no bigger than a silver dollar. But the story behind it would change how everyone saw not just Sarah, but what it truly meant to serve. Because sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought in the sky. Sometimes, they're fought in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the cost of duty becomes personal, and when a single decision can define not just a career, but a life. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to give up, even when everything was taken from her, would eventually earn her the right to fly the Apache. And how a small patch would make a room full of hardened military officers understand that courage comes in many forms. Sarah Chen had always known she was different. Not because she was one of the few women who dreamed of flying military helicopters, but because when other kids played with toys, she was taking them apart to see how they worked. Her father, an immigrant from Taiwan who worked as an aircraft mechanic, would find her in the garage surrounded by radio parts and broken clocks, her small hands covered in grease as she tried to understand the magic that made machines come alive. "You have the touch," he would tell her in his accented English, watching as she carefully reassembled a carburetor that had stumped mechanics twice her age. "Machines, they speak to you. You listen with your hands, not just your ears. Love all, trust a few, do wrong to none. Machines, they speak to you. You listen with your hands, not just your ears, they speak to you." By the time Sarah turned 16, she could rebuild a motorcycle engine blindfolded and had logged over 100 hours as a student pilot in her father's old Cessna. The local flight instructor, a gruff ex-Navy pilot named Duke Morrison, had never seen anything like her natural ability to read the subtle language that aircraft spoke through vibrations, sounds, and the feel of controls in her hands. "Girl's got more stick and rudder sense than most pilots I flew with in Vietnam," Duke would tell anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, she's going to fly something important someday." Sarah's mother, Linda, worried constantly about her daughter's obsession with aircraft. She had immigrated from the Philippines to marry Sarah's father and build a quiet life in small-town America. The idea of her only child wanting to fly military helicopters into combat zones was not the peaceful future she had envisioned. "Why not become a doctor?" Linda would plead during family dinners. "Or an engineer? You're so smart, Sarah. You could do anything." But Sarah's heart was already set on a different path. She had seen the Apache helicopters during an air show when she was 14, watching in awe as the sleek gunships performed their deadly ballet in the sky. The pilots who climbed out of those cockpits afterward weren't just aviators. They were warriors who commanded the most sophisticated attack helicopters ever built. She knew from that moment that she wanted to be one of them. The path to becoming an Apache pilot was brutal even for men. For women, it was nearly impossible. When Sarah enlisted in the Army after high school, female pilots were still banned from combat roles. She spent her first 3 years flying transport helicopters, moving supplies and personnel around bases in Germany and Korea. It was important work, but it wasn't what she had dreamed of. Everything changed in 1993 when the combat exclusion policy was lifted. Suddenly, the Apache program was open to female pilots. Sarah was among the first to volunteer, but volunteering and being accepted were 2 very different things. The selection process was designed to break candidates. Physical fitness requirements that pushed bodies to their limits. Academic coursework that covered everything from aerodynamics to weapon systems to battlefield tactics. Psychological evaluations that probed every corner of a candidate's mind to find weaknesses. And through it all, the constant awareness that instructors were looking for any reason to wash candidates out. Sarah's first day at Apache school was a wake-up call. She walked into a classroom filled with 32 other pilots, all men, all looking at her like she was an interesting specimen in a zoo. The silence when she entered was deafening. "Gentlemen," announced Chief Warrant Officer Mike Reynolds, the lead instructor whose reputation for toughness was legendary throughout the aviation community. "And lady, welcome to Apache School. Look around. Most of you won't be here in 6 months." Reynolds was a Vietnam veteran who had transitioned from flying Cobra gunships to Apaches. His weathered face told stories of battles fought and won, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that came from years of life-and-death decisions made in split seconds. He had trained hundreds of Apache pilots, and his standards were impossibly high. The Apache is not a forgiving aircraft, Reynolds continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived when others hadn't. She's a $17 million weapon system that can deliver more firepower than an entire infantry company. In the wrong hands, she's dangerous to everyone, including the pilot. In the right hands, she's the most lethal aerial weapons platform ever created. Sarah absorbed every word, taking notes in the small notebook she always carried. Around her, the other candidates shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Reynolds outlined the challenges ahead. The academic phase would last 16 weeks, covering systems, weapons, tactics, and maintenance. The flight phase would add another 20 weeks of intensive training that would push their skills to the absolute limit. The Apache has 2 seats, Reynolds explained, pointing to a detailed cutaway diagram of the helicopter. Front seat is the gunner, back seat is the pilot. Both crew members need to master both positions completely. You'll spend half your training in each seat, learning to work as a seamless team. The first weeks were overwhelming. Sarah found herself studying 18 hours a day, memorizing hundreds of pages of technical manuals, system schematics, and emergency procedures. The Apache was incredibly complex, with systems that controlled everything from the targeting sensors to the weapon systems to the advanced flight controls. Every switch, every gauge, every warning light had to become second nature. Her classmates, initially skeptical of having a woman in their group, began to respect her dedication. Sarah was always the first to arrive for morning briefings and the last to leave the study rooms at night. When other candidates struggled with the technical aspects of the helicopter systems, they began coming to her for help.
You really think you can handle this?
Asked Captain Mike Torres one evening as they worked through complex navigation problems together.
Torres was a former infantry officer who had switched to aviation, and his initial skepticism about women in combat roles was well known. I know I can, Sarah replied without looking up from her calculations. The question is whether I'll be given the chance to prove it. Torres studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. But you know it's going to be harder for you than for us, right? Some of the instructors, some of the guys in operational units, they're going to be watching for any sign that you can't cut it. Sarah had already figured that out. Every mistake she made was scrutinized more carefully than similar errors by her male classmates. Every success was questioned more thoroughly. She had to be not just as good as the men around her, but noticeably better. The first major hurdle came during weapons training. The Apache's primary armament included a 30mm chain gun, Hellfire missiles, and 2.75-inch rockets. Understanding how to employ these weapons effectively required not just technical knowledge, but tactical thinking that could adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Chen! Reynolds barked during a particularly challenging scenario. Hostile armor column advancing on friendly positions. You've got 8 Hellfires and 60 rounds of 30mm. How do you prioritize targets? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the battlefield scenario Reynolds had described. She had studied countless case studies of Apache engagements, analyzing how pilots had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and disaster. Primary threats are the command vehicles and air defense systems, she answered. Take out their ability to coordinate and shoot back first. Use Hellfires for the high-value targets at maximum range, then close for gun runs on the remaining vehicles. Save 2 missiles in case we encounter unexpected threats. Reynolds nodded curtly, but Sarah caught the brief flash of approval in his eyes. She was learning to think like an Apache pilot, not just fly like one. As the weeks passed, the class began to thin out. Candidates who couldn't handle the academic workload were eliminated first. Others fell victim to the unforgiving flight training, where even small errors could result in simulated crashes that meant immediate dismissal from the program. Sarah's first solo flight in an Apache was both terrifying and exhilarating. The helicopter was unlike anything she had ever flown. Where transport helicopters were stable and predictable, the Apache was responsive to the point of being twitchy. Every control input had to be precise, every movement calculated. The machine demanded respect and skill in equal measure. But as she lifted off from the training area and felt the Apache respond to her commands, Sarah knew she had found her calling. This wasn't just a helicopter. It was a precision instrument of warfare, and she was learning to play it like a concert musician plays a violin. The other candidates began to accept her not as a novelty, but as a peer. When Lieutenant Jason Parker struggled with the complex targeting systems, It was Sarah who spent hours after class helping him understand the procedures. When Captain Rodriguez had trouble with emergency auto-rotation procedures, Sarah was there to talk him through the techniques that had taken her weeks to master. "You know what I figured out about you?" Torres said one evening as they walked back from the flight line. "You don't just want to fly Apaches, you need to fly them." "It's different." Sarah considered his words carefully. He was right, though she hadn't thought of it in quite those terms before. For her classmates, becoming an Apache pilot was a career goal, a way to advance in the military and gain prestige. For Sarah, it was something deeper. It was proof that she belonged in a world that had spent years telling her she didn't. As the academic phase neared its end, Sarah found herself among the top 5 candidates in the class. Her test scores were consistently excellent, her understanding of Apache systems was thorough, and her tactical thinking impressed even the most skeptical instructors. But she also knew that the real test was still ahead. The flight phase would determine who had what it took to actually fly the Apache in combat conditions. The night before advanced flight training began, Sarah called her parents from the payphone outside the barracks. Her father's voice was filled with pride as he asked about her progress, but she could hear the worry in her mother's questions. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Linda asked, her voice small across the long-distance connection. "It's not too late to choose something safer." Sarah looked up at the stars visible above the base, thinking about all the pilots who had looked at those same stars before going into combat. "Mom, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This is what I was meant to do." After hanging up the phone, Sarah walked slowly back to her quarters, passing the flight line where rows of Apache helicopters sat in the darkness. Tomorrow, the real training would begin. Tomorrow, she would start learning not just to fly the Apache, but to fight in it. She didn't know that among the instructors and evaluation pilots, there were already whispers about the woman who might not belong in an Apache cockpit. She didn't know that some were actively looking for ways to prove that female pilots were a dangerous experiment that needed to end. But she would learn. And when she did, it would test not just her flying skills, but her determination to succeed in a world that was still deciding whether she deserved to be there. The first time Sarah strapped into the front seat of an Apache for combat training, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The helicopter's targeting systems hummed to life around her, displays glowing with information that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Behind her, in the pilot's seat, sat Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, his voice crackling through the intercom. "All right, Jen. Time to see if you can actually fight this thing. We're going to run a basic target engagement scenario. Multiple hostile vehicles, friendlies in the area. Your job is to identify threats, prioritize targets, and engage without hitting the good guys." Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. The Apache's targeting system was a marvel of technology, but it required an operator who could process information quickly and make decisions under pressure. Through the helmet-mounted display, she could see the simulated battlefield spread out below them, digital representations of tanks and personnel carriers moving across the terrain. "Contact, 2 o'clock, 3,000 meters," Sarah called out. Her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Looks like a T-72 tank moving toward the checkpoint." "Roger. Clear to engage," Reynolds replied. But Sarah could hear the evaluation in his voice. He was testing not just her technical skills, but her decision-making under pressure. Sarah centered the crosshairs on the target, waiting for the optimal firing solution. The Hellfire missile was a precision weapon, but even precision weapons could cause collateral damage if used improperly. She had studied hours of gun camera footage from actual combat engagements, watching how experienced pilots made life-and-death decisions in seconds. "Missile away," she announced, watching the digital representation of the Hellfire streak toward its target. "Good hit, target destroyed." "Not bad," Reynolds acknowledged. "But you took too long to make the shot." In real combat, that tank would have had time to engage friendly forces. Speed matters, Chen. Hesitation kills people. The critique stung because Sarah knew he was right. She had been so focused on ensuring a perfect shot that she had forgotten the larger tactical picture. Combat flying wasn't about perfection. It was about making good decisions quickly and living with the consequences. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into mastering the art of aerial warfare. She studied the techniques of veteran Apache pilots, learning how they processed information and made targeting decisions. She spent hours in simulators, running through scenario after scenario until her responses became instinctive. But it wasn't just the technical aspects of flying that challenged her. The culture of the Apache community was unlike anything she had experienced before. These were warriors who had proven themselves in combat, men who had faced enemy fire and survived to tell about it. Sarah was an outsider, trying to earn acceptance in a brotherhood forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging night training mission. Sarah was flying with Captain David Park, a quiet veteran who had flown combat missions during the Gulf War. They were tasked with providing close air support for a simulated ground assault, working with forward observers to identify and engage targets in close proximity to friendly forces. The scenario was deliberately complex, designed to push pilot and gunner teams to their limits. Radio chatter filled their headsets as ground controllers called out target locations and friendly positions. Sarah found herself managing multiple information streams simultaneously, tracking targets while ensuring she didn't endanger the troops they were supposed to protect. Apache 2-7, we've got enemy infantry in the tree line. Danger close to our position, came the urgent call from the ground controller. Can you engage with 30 Mike? Sarah quickly identified the area through her targeting system. The enemy positions were less than 100 meters from friendly forces, well within the danger radius for missile attacks. She would have to use the Apache's 30mm chain gun, a weapon that required precise marksmanship to be effective at close range. Roger, 2-7 engaging with gun, Sarah replied, adjusting her targeting point. The chain gun was devastating against infantry, but accuracy was critical when firing so close to friendly troops. You sure about this shot? Park asked through the intercom. That's cutting it pretty close. Sarah studied the targeting display, calculating angles and distances. She had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times in simulators, but this felt different. The pressure was real, the consequences meaningful, even in training. I'm sure, she replied, her finger finding the trigger. Engaging now. The 30mm gun thundered to life, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the tree line. Sarah walked the fire across the target area with surgical precision, her years of training evident in the controlled bursts that eliminated the simulated threats without endangering the friendly forces nearby. Excellent shooting, came the enthusiastic response from the ground controller. Targets eliminated. You guys just saved our bacon. After landing, Park was unusually quiet as they walked through the post-flight debrief. Finally, as they were securing their equipment, he turned to Sarah with a serious expression. That was some of the best gun work I've seen in 20 years of flying, he said simply. You've got the instincts for this, Chen. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Word of Sarah's performance began to spread through the tight-knit Apache community. Instructors who had been skeptical of her abilities started to take notice. Her classmates, who had initially viewed her as an experiment that might not work out, began to see her as a valuable team member, but not everyone was convinced. There were still voices within the Apache community who believed that women didn't belong in combat aircraft, regardless of their skills. These critics pointed to physical differences, argued about unit cohesion, and questioned whether female pilots could handle the psychological stress of combat. The tension came to a head during a training exercise that pitted student crews against experienced instructor pilots in simulated combat. Sarah found herself paired with Lieutenant Parker, the candidate she had helped through the targeting systems training. Their opponents were two of the most experienced Apache pilots in the Army, men who had logged thousands of combat hours and were known for their aggressive flying style. Remember, Parker said as they strapped into their helicopter, these guys are going to try to embarrass us. They want to prove that students, especially female students, don't belong in the same sky with them. Sarah nodded, her jaw set with determination. She had worked too hard and come too far to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of their experience or reputation. The exercise began with both teams maneuvering for position over the training area. The instructor crews had the advantage of experience, but Sarah and Parker had the motivation of pilots with everything to prove. Sarah found herself thinking not just about the immediate tactical situation, but about all the young women who might follow in her footsteps if she succeeded. Contact left, 4 o'clock low. Sarah called out, spotting one of the opposing Apaches trying to use terrain to mask its approach. He's trying to get behind us. Parker immediately broke into a defensive turn, using the Apache's agility to deny the instructor pilot a clear shot. Sarah kept her targeting system trained on the threat, waiting for an opportunity to engage. He's good, Parker muttered through the intercom. Really good. The aerial chess match continued for several minutes, with both sides maneuvering for advantage. Sarah realized that she was learning as much from this engagement as she had from weeks of classroom instruction. This was what real Apache flying was about, thinking 3 moves ahead while reacting instantly to changing situations. The opportunity came when the instructor pilot made a slight error in positioning, exposing his aircraft for just a few seconds as he maneuvered around a ridgeline. Sarah didn't hesitate, immediately locking onto the target and simulating a missile engagement. Fox 2, she called out, using the standard terminology for a Hellfire launch. Direct hit. The exercise controllers confirmed the kill, and Sarah could hear the surprise in the instructor pilot's voice as he acknowledged being shot down. After landing, he approached Sarah with a combination of respect and bewilderment. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "That was a hell of a shot under pressure." "From people like you," Sarah replied honestly. "I've been studying gun camera footage from combat veterans for months, trying to understand how you make decisions so quickly." The instructor pilot, Major Tom Bradley, studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "Well, you learned the lessons well. That was as good as any shot I've seen in combat." As word of Sarah's performance in the training exercise spread, the atmosphere around her began to change. Instructors who had been waiting for her to fail started treating her like a legitimate Apache pilot. Her classmates stopped viewing her as an outsider and began including her in the informal networks where real learning took place. But Sarah knew that training was one thing and operational assignment was another. Even if she graduated at the top of her class, she would still need to prove herself all over again when she reached her first operational unit. Apache squadrons were tight-knit organizations where new pilots had to earn their place through competence and reliability. The final phase of training involved complex multi-aircraft missions that simulated real combat scenarios. Sarah found herself leading formations of Apache helicopters in coordinated attacks against heavily defended targets. The training was as realistic as possible without actual enemy fire, pushing student pilots to make decisions that would prepare them for the chaos of real combat. During one particularly challenging exercise, Sarah's formation was tasked with destroying a simulated airfield defended by surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. The mission required precise coordination between multiple aircraft, each with specific target assignments and carefully planned ingress and egress routes. "Apache lead, this is Cobra 7-1, came the call from the air controller. Your target is hot. Multiple SAM sites active, expect heavy resistance." Sarah acknowledged the warning while reviewing her mission brief one final time. She would be leading 3 other Apache helicopters in a coordinated attack, with each aircraft responsible for different aspects of the target complex. The margin for error was minimal, and a single mistake could result in simulated losses that would reflect poorly on her leadership abilities. "All Apache elements. This is lead," Sarah transmitted to her formation. "We'll execute the attack as briefed. Stay tight on timing and watch for threats." Questions. The responses came back crisp and professional. Sarah's classmates, who had initially questioned whether they could trust her in a leadership role, had learned to respect her tactical thinking and decision-making abilities. The attack unfolded with clockwork precision. Sarah led her formation through the heavily defended airspace, using terrain masking and electronic countermeasures to avoid the simulated missile threats. Each helicopter engaged its assigned targets on schedule, and the entire formation exited the target area without losses. "Outstanding execution," came the assessment from the exercise controllers. "That's how it's supposed to be done." After landing, Reynolds approached Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. The gruff instructor who had spent months testing her limits and pushing her to excel was actually smiling. "Chen, you just led one of the best attack missions I've seen from student pilots," he said. "You're thinking like an Apache pilot now, not just flying like one." As graduation approached, Sarah found herself at the top of her class academically and tactically. Her instructor evaluations praised her technical competence, her tactical thinking, and her ability to perform under pressure. But she also knew that her real challenges were just beginning. The Apache community was small and insular. Word traveled quickly about new pilots, and reputations were built or destroyed based on performance in operational units. Sarah would be joining a squadron where she would be the only female pilot, working with men who might still question whether she belonged there. On the night before graduation, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, looking at the Apache wings that she would pin to her uniform the next day. She thought about her father, who had taught her that machines spoke a language that could be learned by anyone willing to listen. She thought about her mother, who had worried about her daughter's dangerous dreams but supported her anyway. Most of all, she thought about all the young women who might someday follow the path she was blazing. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the opportunity. She was about to become one of the first female Apache pilots in Army history, and everything she did from this point forward would help determine whether others would get the same chance. Tomorrow she would officially become an Apache pilot. But tonight, she was still just Sarah Chen, a mechanic's daughter who had dreamed of flying the deadliest helicopter in the world. And despite everything that lay ahead, she had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. Fort Hood, Texas, sprawled across the horizon like a small city dedicated to the art of warfare. Sarah drove through the main gate for the first time as a newly graduated Apache pilot, her orders directing her to report to the 1st Cavalry Division's Aviation Brigade. The weight of her new wings felt both familiar and foreign against her chest, a symbol of achievement that had come with a cost she was only beginning to understand. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Aviation Regiment, was housed in a complex of hangars and administrative buildings that hummed with the constant activity of an operational Apache unit. Unlike the sterile training environment she had left behind, this place had the lived-in feel of pilots and mechanics who worked together to maintain constant readiness for deployment anywhere in the world. Sarah reported to the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a veteran pilot whose office walls were covered with photographs from combat deployments spanning 2 decades. Morrison was a legend in the Apache community, known for his tactical brilliance and his unwavering support for pilots who proved themselves capable. "Welcome to the Lancers, Captain Chen," Morrison said, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. "I've been following your progress through training. Impressive scores, excellent instructor evaluations. Thank you, sir. I'm ready to contribute to the mission." Morrison studied her for a moment, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. "I'm sure you are, but I want to be clear about something from the start. This unit has a reputation for excellence that was built over many years and multiple deployments. Every pilot here has earned their place through competence and reliability. You'll be given the same opportunities as everyone else, but you'll also be held to the same standards." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. She would be judged on her performance, nothing more and nothing less. It was exactly what she had hoped for. "You'll be assigned to Alpha Company initially," Morrison continued. "Captain Mike Torres is the company commander. I believe you know him from training." Sarah felt a surge of relief. Torres had been one of her classmates, one of the pilots who had initially been skeptical, but had come to respect her abilities. Having a familiar face in a leadership position would make the transition easier. Alpha Company's operations center was a bustling hub of activity when Sarah reported for duty. Pilots and crew chiefs moved between workstations covered with maps, flight schedules, and maintenance status boards. The constant chatter of radios provided a soundtrack of ongoing training flights and administrative coordination. Torres looked up from a stack of flight plans when Sarah entered his office. His face broke into a genuine smile, the first truly warm welcome she had received since arriving at Fort Hood. "Well, if it isn't the best gunner in our class," he said, standing to shake her hand. "Welcome to Alpha Company, Sarah. Glad to have you aboard." "Thanks, Mike. It's good to see a friendly face." "Let me introduce you to the other pilots," Torres said, leading her toward the main operations area. "Most of these guys are solid. A few might need some time to adjust to having a female pilot in the unit, but they'll come around once they see you fly." The introductions were a mix of professional courtesy and barely concealed curiosity. Some of the pilots had clearly heard about Sarah's training performance and seemed genuinely interested in working with her. Others were more reserved, their handshakes polite but their eyes skeptical. Captain Rick Anderson was the most vocal of the skeptics. A veteran pilot with multiple combat deployments, Anderson had earned a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness. When Torres introduced Sarah to him, Anderson's assessment was immediate and harsh. "So you're the female pilot everyone's been talking about," he said without preamble. "I hope you're as good as your reputation suggests, because this isn't training anymore. When we deploy, people's lives depend on every pilot in this unit being able to do their job without hesitation." "I understand that," Sarah replied, meeting his stare directly. "I wouldn't be here if I couldn't handle the responsibility." Anderson studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged. "I guess we'll find out soon enough." The first few weeks at Fort Hood were a whirlwind of orientation briefings, unit training, and integration into Alpha Company's operational rhythm. Sarah was assigned to fly with different pilots as part of her progression training, learning the unit's specific procedures and tactical approaches. Her first flight with Chief Warrant Officer David Kim was revelatory. Kim was a quiet, methodical pilot who had refined his techniques through years of experience. As they lifted off for a routine training mission, Sarah immediately noticed the difference between his flying and the instruction she had received in school. "Training teaches you how to fly the Apache safely," Kim explained through the intercom as they maneuvered toward the training area. "Operational flying teaches you how to fly it effectively. The difference is subtle but critical." Over the next hour, Kim demonstrated techniques that weren't in any manual: how to use terrain and weather to maximum advantage, how to position the aircraft to minimize exposure to threats while maintaining effective fields of fire, how to coordinate with other aircraft in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of the entire formation. "You've got good instincts," Kim told her after they landed. But you're still thinking like a student pilot. You need to start thinking like a warrior. Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about operational flying. She studied after-action reports from recent deployments, learning how Apache units had been employed in combat operations around the world. She spent hours with maintenance personnel, understanding how the helicopters were kept mission-ready despite the demanding operational tempo. But it was her growing relationship with her assigned crew chief, Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, that taught her the most about what it meant to be part of an Apache crew. Rodriguez was a master mechanic who had worked on helicopters for over 15 years, and she took personal responsibility for every aircraft that flew under her care. "This bird is your life insurance policy," Rodriguez explained as she walked Sarah through the detailed pre-flight inspection procedures used by the unit. "Every rivet, every wire, every component has to be perfect before you strap in and take off. My job is to make sure you come back alive. Your job is to not do anything stupid that wastes my effort." The relationship between pilot and crew chief was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. Rodriguez knew the helicopter better than its designers, could diagnose problems by sound alone, and had an almost mystical ability to keep aging aircraft flying when logic suggested they should be grounded. In return, she expected pilots to treat her aircraft with the respect it deserved. Sarah's first real test came during a large-scale training exercise that involved the entire aviation brigade. Alpha Company was tasked with providing close air support for a simulated ground assault, working with multiple helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft in a complex scenario designed to replicate real combat conditions. The mission brief was intimidating. Sarah would be flying as part of a four-ship formation led by Anderson, providing fire support for ground forces attacking a heavily defended objective. The exercise would include live fire with training ammunition, electronic warfare simulation, and realistic threat representations that would push every crew to their limits. "This is your chance to prove you belong here," Torres told Sarah during the final brief. "Anderson's been watching you since you arrived. If you perform well today, you'll earn his respect. If you don't..." Sarah understood the implications. Anderson's opinion carried significant weight within the company, and his assessment of her capabilities would influence how other pilots treated her for months to come. The exercise began before dawn, with the Apache formation taking off in darkness and navigating to the objective area using night vision systems. Sarah found herself flying wing position to Anderson, responsible for maintaining formation integrity while remaining alert for threats and targets. "All Apache elements, this is Saber Lead," came Anderson's voice through the radio. "Objective area is 10 minutes out. Expect heavy resistance. Stay sharp." As they approached the target area, Sarah could see traces from simulated enemy fire streaking across the sky. Ground controllers were calling out target locations and friendly positions in rapid succession, creating the kind of information overload that separated experienced combat pilots from those who couldn't handle the pressure. "Apache 2-4, this is Groundhog 6, came an urgent call from the ground forces. "We're taking heavy fire from a building complex at grid 123. 456, can you engage?" Anderson immediately began maneuvering toward the target area. But Sarah could see that his approach would expose the formation to simulated surface-to-air missile threats. Without hesitation, she keyed her radio. "Saber Lead, recommend approach from the north. SAM site at your 2 o'clock will have a clear shot if you continue current heading." There was a moment of silence before Anderson responded. "Roger, 2-4. "Good call. All elements, follow me north." The attack that followed was a textbook example of Apache employment. Anderson led the formation in a coordinated assault that eliminated the simulated threats while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Sarah found herself completely absorbed in the tactical situation, her training and instincts combining to help her process information and make decisions at the speed of combat. "Outstanding work," came the assessment from the exercise controllers after the mission concluded. "Saber flight, that was a perfect execution of close air support." As they walked away from their helicopters after landing, Anderson approached Sarah with the expression she hadn't seen from him before. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect. "That was good situational awareness back there," he said simply. "You might actually make a decent Apache pilot." Coming from Anderson, it was high praise. Word of Sarah's performance during the exercise spread through Alpha Company quickly, and she could feel a subtle shift in how the other pilots treated her. She was no longer the experimental female pilot who might not work out. She was becoming simply another member of the team. But Sarah's real test was still ahead. 3 months after arriving at Fort Hood, Alpha Company received deployment orders to Bosnia as part of the ongoing peacekeeping mission in the Balkans. It would be Sarah's first operational deployment, her chance to prove that she could perform under the stress and uncertainty of real-world operations. The deployment briefings painted a picture of a complex operational environment where Apache helicopters would be used for reconnaissance, show-of-force missions, and potential combat operations if the fragile peace agreement collapsed. It was exactly the kind of challenging assignment that would test every skill Sarah had learned. "Bosnia's not a training exercise," Morrison told the assembled pilots during the final pre-deployment brief. "The people shooting at you won't be using training ammunition, and the decisions you make will have real consequences. Every one of you needs to be ready for anything." As Sarah packed her gear for deployment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From the garage where her father had taught her to listen to machines, through the challenges of training, to this moment when she was about to deploy as an operational Apache pilot. She was no longer fighting just to prove that women could fly attack helicopters. She was fighting to prove that she deserved to be counted among the elite pilots who flew the most dangerous missions in the world. The small patch she would soon carry with her would remind her every day of what that fight had cost. But first, she had to survive Bosnia. She had to prove that all the training, all the struggle, all the determination had created a pilot who could be trusted with the lives of fellow soldiers and the success of critical missions. The transport plane that would carry Alpha Company to Europe was waiting on the tarmac, its cargo hold already loaded with the equipment and ammunition they would need for the deployment. Sarah walked toward it with her gear bag slung over her shoulder, thinking about her parents and the pride in their voices during her last phone call home. Tomorrow, she would be in a foreign country, flying combat missions in an Apache helicopter. But tonight, she was still just a pilot with something to prove, carrying dreams that had begun in her father's garage, and hopes that reached far beyond her own career. The real test was about to begin. The Balkans in 1996 were a patchwork of ethnic tensions barely held in check by international peacekeeping forces. Sarah's first view of Bosnia came through the small window of the transport aircraft as it descended toward Tuzla Air Base, revealing a landscape scarred by years of conflict. Burned-out buildings and hastily repaired infrastructure told the story of a region struggling to rebuild after devastating war. Alpha Company's Apache helicopters had been disassembled for transport and would need several days of intensive work to be reassembled and tested before they could begin operations. Sarah threw herself into the process, working alongside Rodriguez and the other maintenance personnel to ensure that every system was functioning perfectly. "Different world over here," Rodriguez commented as they performed detailed inspections on their helicopter. Training exercises back home never included the possibility of actually getting shot down by people who really want to kill you. The reality of their situation became clear during the initial intelligence briefings. While the Dayton Peace Agreement had officially ended the war, tensions remained high between the various ethnic groups. Apache helicopters would be used for reconnaissance missions along ethnic boundary lines, escort duties for supply convoys, and show-of-force missions designed to deter potential troublemakers. "Our mission is to keep the peace," explained Major Frank Coleman, the intelligence officer who briefed the pilots on current threats. "But make no mistake, there are still armed groups operating in this region who view American forces as legitimate targets. Every mission you fly could turn into a combat situation with very little warning." Sarah's first operational mission came just a week after arriving in Bosnia. She was assigned to fly with Anderson on a reconnaissance patrol along the inter-entity boundary line, the invisible border that separated the different ethnic regions. Their job was to observe and report any unusual activity that might indicate preparation for renewed hostilities. The landscape below them as they flew their patrol route was both beautiful and haunting. Rolling hills and forests that should have been peaceful were marked by the geometric scars of military positions and the occasional burned-out village that served as a reminder of recent violence. "Stay alert," Anderson warned through the intercom. "Intelligence reports suggest there might be some SAM systems still unaccounted for in this area. The war might be over officially, but not everyone got the message." Sarah kept her eyes moving constantly, scanning for signs of military activity or potential threats. The Apache's advanced sensors could detect vehicle movements and communications intercepts that might indicate trouble brewing, but the most important sensor was still the human eye of a trained observer. The mission proceeded without incident for the first 2 hours. They observed several checkpoints manned by international peacekeeping forces and noted the positions of various local military units. All information that would be compiled into intelligence reports used to assess the stability of the region. Then, everything changed in an instant. "Apache 2-4, this is Groundhog Base," came an urgent call from their base operations center. "We've got reports of a medical emergency at Checkpoint Charlie. International peacekeepers are requesting immediate evacuation of a critically injured soldier. Can you respond? Anderson didn't hesitate. Roger, Groundhog. We're en route to Checkpoint Charlie. Medical evacuation wasn't technically part of their mission, but Apache crews were trained to respond to emergencies when they were the closest available asset. Anderson immediately changed course toward the checkpoint, pushing the helicopter to maximum speed, while Sarah coordinated with ground controllers to get more information about the situation. Injured soldier stepped on an unexploded landmine, came the report from the checkpoint. Severe leg injuries, critical bleeding. He needs to get to a trauma center within the next 30 minutes, or he's not going to make it. The checkpoint was located in a valley surrounded by hills that could hide potential threats. As they approached, Sarah could see the collection of armored vehicles and temporary shelters that marked the position. A small group of soldiers was gathered around what appeared to be a casualty evacuation site. Landing zone looks secure, Sarah reported as she scanned the area for threats. No signs of hostile activity. Anderson brought the Apache into a hover near the checkpoint, but immediately realized they had a problem. The injured soldier was too severely wounded to be safely transported in an attack helicopter designed for 2 crew members, not medical casualties. Groundhog Base, this is Apache 2-4, Anderson radioed. We need a medevac helicopter here ASAP. The casualty is too badly injured for us to transport safely. Negative 2-4. Closest medevac bird is 40 minutes out. You're the only aircraft available. Sarah could see the dilemma clearly. Moving the injured soldier could worsen his injuries, but leaving him at the checkpoint meant he would likely bleed to death before proper medical evacuation arrived. It was exactly the kind of impossible decision that operational flying presented with regular frequency. We can do it, Sarah said quietly through the intercom. I can get out and help stabilize him for transport. I've got combat medic training. Anderson was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the risks. Leaving the aircraft meant that Sarah would be exposed and vulnerable if the situation turned hostile, but it also might be the difference between saving a life and losing one. Do it, Anderson decided. But stay alert. This whole thing could be a setup. Sarah unbuckled her harness and prepared to exit the helicopter, grabbing the first aid kit from her survival gear. As she approached the group of peacekeepers surrounding the injured soldier, she could see the severity of his wounds. The landmine had mangled his left leg below the knee, and he was losing blood at a dangerous rate. I'm a trained combat medic, Sarah told the senior peacekeeper, a British sergeant who was trying to apply pressure to the worst of the bleeding. What's his status? Conscious but going into shock, the sergeant replied. We've got pressure bandages on the worst bleeding, but he needs surgery soon or he's not going to make it. Sarah quickly assessed the injuries and began applying more sophisticated trauma care techniques she had learned during her military training. The soldier was young, probably not much older than herself, and his eyes held the kind of fear that came with knowing you might be dying. You're going to be okay, Sarah told him, as she worked to stabilize his injuries for transport. We're going to get you to a hospital. Getting the wounded soldier into the Apache required creativity and careful coordination. The helicopter's cockpit wasn't designed for medical casualties, but they managed to secure him in the front seat, with Sarah monitoring his condition from the back. Anderson immediately took off for the nearest medical facility, a field hospital operated by international forces about 20 minutes away. During the flight, Sarah worked constantly to keep the soldier stable. His blood pressure was dropping, and she could see signs that he was going into deeper shock despite their efforts. She found herself talking to him constantly, partly to keep him conscious, and partly to keep herself focused on something other than the possibility that he might die before they reached help. What's your name? She asked as she checked his pulse for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Tommy, he replied weakly. Tommy Morrison. I'm from Scotland. Well, Tommy Morrison from Scotland, you're going to have some great stories to tell when you get home. How many people can say they were rescued by an Apache helicopter? Tommy managed a weak smile despite his pain. Are you really a pilot? You don't look old enough. I get that a lot, Sarah replied, continuing to monitor his vital signs. But I promise you, I know what I'm doing. The flight to the field hospital felt like it took hours, but Sarah knew from her instruments that it was less than 20 minutes. As they approached the landing zone, she could see medical personnel waiting with a stretcher and equipment. The moment Anderson touched down, the medical team swarmed the helicopter and began the process of transferring Tommy to their care. You did good work, one of the doctors told Sarah as they prepared to take Tommy into surgery. Your field treatment probably saved his life. As Sarah and Anderson flew back to base after the successful medical evacuation, she felt a complex mix of emotions. The mission had been successful, but it had also driven home the reality of their deployment in ways that training exercises never could. People's lives really did depend on their competence and decision-making. That was well done, Anderson said through the intercom as they approached Tuzla Air Base. You kept your head under pressure and probably saved that kid's life. Word of the medical evacuation spread quickly through Alpha Company. Sarah found that her willingness to leave the safety of the helicopter to help a wounded soldier had earned her a different kind of respect from the other pilots. She was no longer just the female pilot who had proven she could fly. She was a crew member who could be counted on when things went wrong. But the medical evacuation also marked the beginning of a series of increasingly dangerous missions that would test every skill Sarah had learned. Intelligence reports indicated that some armed groups were becoming more active, and Apache crews found themselves flying more reconnaissance missions in areas where the threat level was uncertain. 3 weeks after the medical evacuation, Sarah found herself assigned to what should have been a routine patrol mission along the boundary between Bosnian Serb and Bosnian Muslim territories. She was flying with Captain Torres, and their mission was to observe a series of checkpoints and report on any unusual activity. The weather was marginal, with low clouds and intermittent rain that reduced visibility and made flying more challenging. Sarah found herself working harder than usual to maintain visual contact with landmarks and navigate accurately in the poor conditions. Groundhog Base, this is Sabre 1-6. Torres called to their operations center. We're getting some unusual radio traffic in this area. Sounds like military communications, but we can't identify the source. Roger 1-6. Continue your patrol and report anything unusual. As they approached a small village near one of their planned checkpoints, Sarah noticed something that didn't look right. Through her targeting system, she could see what appeared to be military vehicles positioned in locations that would be concealed from ground observation but visible to aircraft flying overhead. Mike, I'm seeing vehicles in the tree line east of the village, Sarah reported. Looks like they're trying to stay hidden. Torres immediately maneuvered for a better view, while Sarah used the Apache's sensors to get detailed imagery of the suspicious activity. What she saw made her blood run cold. The vehicles were definitely military, and they appeared to be positioning for some kind of operation. Those are T-55 tanks, Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. At least 4 of them, positioned for an assault on the village. The implications were immediately clear to both pilots. If armed forces were preparing to attack civilian areas, it represented exactly the kind of escalation that international peacekeeping forces were deployed to prevent. But it also meant that Sarah and Torres had stumbled into a situation that could turn deadly very quickly. Groundhog Base, this is Sabre 1-6. Torres radioed urgently. We have eyes on at least 4 tanks positioned for apparent attack on civilian village. Request immediate instructions. The response came back within seconds. 1-6, maintain observation and report. Do not, repeat do not, engage unless fired upon. We're scrambling additional assets to your location. Sarah kept her targeting system focused on the tanks, while Torres maneuvered to maintain visual contact without exposing them to potential ground fire. She could feel her heart racing as she realized that they were potentially witnessing the beginning of a renewed outbreak of ethnic violence. Then one of the tanks began moving toward the village, and Sarah knew that observation alone wasn't going to be enough to prevent a massacre. The decision she was about to make would define not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. The moment stretched like eternity as Sarah watched the lead tank begin its advance toward the village below. Through her targeting system, she could see civilians moving between the buildings, unaware of the danger approaching through the tree line. Children played in a small square, while women hung laundry on lines between houses. In less than 10 minutes, those same streets could be running with blood. Groundhog Base. Tanks are moving toward the village, Torres transmitted, his voice tight with controlled urgency. We need permission to engage now, or we're about to witness a massacre. The response crackled through their headsets with bureaucratic caution that felt obscene in the face of impending violence. Negative, Sabre 1-6. Maintain observation. Higher headquarters is coordinating response. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized that by the time higher headquarters finished coordinating, it would be too late for the people in the village below. She had joined the military to protect people, and now she was being ordered to watch while innocent civilians were slaughtered. Mike, she said quietly through the intercom, we can't just sit here and watch this happen. Torres was silent for a moment, understanding the weight of what Sarah was suggesting. They could engage the tanks and almost certainly stop the attack on the village. But they would also be violating direct orders and potentially starting an international incident that could escalate the fragile peace process. If we engage without authorization, our careers are over, Torres replied. They'll court-martial both of us. And if we don't engage, those people down there are dead, Sarah responded. I didn't become a pilot to watch children get murdered while I had the power to stop it. Through her targeting system, Sarah could see that the tanks had cleared the tree line and were advancing in formation toward the village. The lead tank was less than 500 meters from the first buildings, close enough that the civilians would be able to see it approaching. People were starting to run. The sight of families fleeing their homes, with children in their arms, made Sarah's decision for her. She switched her weapon system to active and began the target acquisition sequence for a Hellfire missile engagement. Sarah, don't, Torres warned. Think about what you're doing. I am thinking about it, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I'm thinking about what I'll see in the mirror every morning for the rest of my life if I let this happen. The lead tank was now close enough to the village that Sarah could see people scattering in panic as they realized what was happening. The tank's main gun was traversing toward the buildings, preparing to fire on structures that might contain families trying to hide. Sarah locked onto the lead tank and squeezed the trigger. Hellfire away, she announced as the missile streaked towards its target. The explosion when the missile hit was visible even from their distance. A bright flash followed by a column of smoke that marked the destruction of the tank and its crew. The other tanks immediately stopped their advance and began searching for the source of the attack. All tanks engaging, Torres said grimly as he maneuvered the Apache to avoid return fire. We're committed now. Sarah was already locking onto the second tank, her training taking over despite the magnitude of what she was doing. The engagement that followed was brief but intense, with Sarah firing 3 more Hellfire missiles to destroy the remaining tanks before they could reach the village or effectively return fire. All targets destroyed, Sarah reported as the last tank erupted in flames. Villages secure. The radio silence that followed was deafening. Sarah knew that every transmission was being recorded, that her decision to engage without authorization was documented in ways that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. Finally, Groundhog Base came back on the radio, and Sarah could hear the strain in the controller's voice. Sabre 1-6, return to base immediately. Report to the commander upon landing. The flight back to Tuzla Air Base was the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. Torres was silent in the pilot's seat, and Sarah knew he was thinking about the consequences they would both face for her decision to engage. She had potentially ended both their careers with 4 trigger pulls, but she couldn't bring herself to regret saving the lives in that village. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was waiting for them when they landed, his face grim as he approached their helicopter. Sarah had never seen him look so serious, and she braced herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. Captain Chen, Captain Torres, report to my office immediately, Morrison said without preamble. Leave your gear here. The walk to Morrison's office felt like a death march. Sarah's mind raced through the justifications she would offer for actions, but she knew that violating direct orders was a serious offense regardless of the circumstances. The best she could hope for was that the lives she had saved would be taken into account during her court-martial. Morrison's office was crowded when they arrived. In addition to the battalion commander, Sarah saw Major Coleman, the intelligence officer, and several other senior leaders she didn't recognize. The atmosphere was tense enough to cut with a knife. Sit down, Morrison said, gesturing to 2 chairs in front of his desk. We need to discuss what happened out there today. Before Sarah could respond, one of the officers she didn't recognize stepped forward. He was a full colonel with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. I'm Colonel David Harrison from Division Headquarters, he said. I've been monitoring the situation through your radio transmissions, and I need to understand exactly what happened from your perspective. Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain the sequence of events that had led to her decision to engage. She described the positioning of the tanks, the movement toward the village, and the civilians who were clearly in immediate danger. Throughout her account, the officers listened without interruption, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. When she finished, Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment before speaking.
Captain Chen, you violated direct orders to maintain observation only.
You engaged enemy targets without authorization from higher headquarters. Do you understand the gravity of what you did? Yes, sir, I do, Sarah replied. But I also understand that if I hadn't engaged, innocent people would have died while we waited for permission to save them. Harrison nodded slowly. Intelligence reports confirm that the tanks you destroyed were manned by rogue elements planning to massacre civilian populations in retaliation for perceived grievances. Your actions undoubtedly saved lives. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but Harrison wasn't finished. However, the decision to engage was not yours to make. Military operations require coordination and authorization to prevent exactly the kind of escalation that unauthorized attacks can cause. The room fell silent as Harrison seemed to weigh his next words carefully. Sarah braced herself for the announcement that she would be facing court-martial proceedings. Instead, Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small object that Sarah couldn't immediately identify. It was a patch, she realized, but unlike any military insignia she had seen before. There are moments in military service, Harrison said, when the right thing to do and the authorized thing to do are not the same thing. When that happens, it takes a special kind of courage to choose correctly. He handed the patch to Sarah, and she looked down at it with confusion. It was simple and understated, showing a small figure standing between much larger shapes that might have been tanks or buildings. Below the image were two words, "For others." This patch was created specifically to recognize actions taken to protect civilian lives at personal risk to military personnel, Harrison explained. It's not an official military decoration, but it's worn by a very select group of people who have made the choice you made today. Sarah stared at the patch, not fully understanding what was happening. "Sir, I don't understand. Am I being disciplined or commended?" Morrison spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "You're being transferred, Captain. Effective immediately, you're being assigned to a special operations unit that handles situations where conventional rules of engagement may not be sufficient to protect civilian populations." The implications began to sink in as Harrison continued. "Your actions today demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and moral courage that this assignment requires. You'll be working in situations where split-second decisions can mean the difference between saving lives and watching atrocities unfold." "What about my violation of orders?" Sarah asked. "Officially, you engaged hostile forces that presented an imminent threat to civilian populations," Harrison replied. "The after-action report will reflect that your rapid response prevented a massacre and demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment under pressure." Torres shifted in his chair beside her. "What about me, sir?" Morrison smiled for the first time since they had returned from the mission. "You'll be taking command of Alpha Company's operations section. Your performance as Sarah's pilot today showed that you can make hard decisions under pressure. We need people like that in leadership positions." As Sarah left Morrison's office with the special patch in her hand, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that she wouldn't face court-martial, pride that her actions had been recognized as necessary and appropriate, but also a deep understanding that her military career had just taken a direction she had never anticipated. The special operations assignment would take her away from traditional Apache units and into situations where the rules were different, where the stakes were higher, and where the margin for error was essentially zero. It was both an honor and a burden that would define the rest of her military service. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, holding the small patch and thinking about the village she had helped save. She thought about the children who would grow up because she had chosen to act rather than observe. She thought about her parents, who had always taught her to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. Most of all, she thought about all the young women who might follow in her footsteps, who might face similar moments when they would have to choose between following orders and following their conscience. The patch in her hand wasn't just recognition of what she had done. It was a symbol of what was possible when courage was combined with competence and conviction. 3 months later, Captain Sarah Chen stood in front of Colonel Harrison's desk again, this time to receive her new assignment orders. The Special Operations Unit she would be joining operated in some of the most dangerous places in the world, protecting civilians and supporting peacekeeping operations where conventional forces couldn't be effective. "Are you ready for this?" Harrison asked as he handed her the classified briefing packet that contained her new mission parameters. Sarah looked down at the patch sewn onto her uniform, a simple reminder of the choice she had made in the skies over Bosnia. "I'm ready." As she walked out of the headquarters building toward the aircraft that would take her to her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From her father's garage, where she had first learned to listen to machines, through the challenges of training and the skepticism of those who doubted her capabilities, to this moment when she was being entrusted with missions that few pilots would ever see. The patch on her uniform would always remind her of the day when being an Apache pilot had meant more than just flying a helicopter. It had meant making a choice that defined not just her career but her character, and that choice had opened doors to a future she could never have imagined. The helicopter lifted off into the morning sky, carrying Sarah toward new challenges and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the courage to do what's right, even when the cost is uncertain. The little girl who had once dreamed of flying the deadliest helicopter in the world had grown into a pilot who understood that true strength came not from the weapons at her command, but from the wisdom to know when and how to use them in service of others. And that understanding would guide her through everything that lay ahead.